they start calling his full name from somewhere behind the drywall. A soft, urgent whisper that slides along the studs like breath and makes the kitchen light flicker. He presses his ear to the plaster, and the voice answers with a private memory he never spoke aloud, the exact smell of his mother's hair after rain, the precise cadence of a lullaby he thought only he could hear. And for the first time, the house sounds like it knows him. Before we go any further, I ask you a favor. Like the video, subscribe to my channel, and leave a comment below this video with the time you listened to this story. He pulled at vents until they complained with metal song and returned the tiny languages of older houses. Fingertips came away dusted in a chalky film. Nails rhymed with gypsum, and a sour tang of old insulation filled his nose like rusted honey. Every scrape of metal against drywall sent the whisper traveling again. A mimic with patience. At first it was his childhood nickname, the one his aunt used that sounded too small for an adult. Then a low, rolling laugh that could have been his father's on a summer porch. Then an ache of syllables that matched the way his sister used to say goodnight, layer upon layer. Voices arranged themselves into a familiarity he could not untangle. He began to doubt his memory. Neighbors shrugged when he asked them if they had heard anything the landlord said. Old buildings settle and groan and leak ghosts of sound, but the calls grew more precise. They came from the same stretch behind the living room wall, the place where the wallpaper was thin and faint pencil marks showed through. The marks, a child's measuring of height gone stale with dust. He stared at those ghostly lines and felt as if someone had left a map to him, but inked on the back of the house recording did nothing. Phones picked up only his expensive audio software, returned phantoms and artifacts. A chorus that fragmented and refused to commit to a single truth. He left a tape recorder for an afternoon and came back to find its blinking light untouched, but the batteries sapped as if something had drunk them dry. He tried to follow the wires from the thermostat like a detective tracing a trail, fingers cold on plastic conduits, pulse quickening with each turn of the cord into the wall. There were small things that became curious, scuffs in the paint at a height no one his size could reach, dust that seemed brushed away in bars, as if palms had slid along the studs, and a faint oval of fresher plaster behind a picture. He started sleeping in the living room because it felt less like permission and more like a compromise. Because when he was awake, the wall called his name, and when he slept, the sound stopped, like some bargain kept on nights when wind scraped the edges of the building. The whisper braided itself with wind, and he could no longer tell which was the house and which was not. Sometimes the voice was cruelly specific and uselessly tender in the same breath. It recited things he thought were forgotten. The number of freckles on his right forearm, the exact temperature of the baking pans his mother kept in the attic, the name of a teacher he had loose notes about. Once it said the color of the shirt he had worn on the day he first kissed someone, the whisper announced the color, as if it were a verdict. He began to leave small tests. He would lock his bedroom door and then run to the living room and shout nonsense nicknames to an empty wall, jamming letters together until they sounded like machinery. Sometimes the wall answered with gibberish, sometimes with the precise pet name he had used for 6 months at 19, and never again. He bought better locks and better doors, and still the voice edged through. He tried to convince himself it was grief, or loneliness, or a trick of acoustics. He would stand with his palm flat on the wall and breathe, and sometimes the plaster would feel warm, and other times cold, as if the house had a fever. His hands collected dust and small crumbs of paper, and in the corners of his eyes, he began to think he saw movement, a slight give in the pattern of wallpaper, as if something shifted behind it. When he visited a hardware store, he found himself lingering by the thin sheets of lath and panels, imagining the seam where 2 boards met like the mouth of someone who knows too much. He asked a friend, curious and terrified, to spend an evening with him, and the friend obliged and drank and laughed and fell asleep on the couch while the wall worked. At one point, the voice said the friend's childhood nickname, and the friend woke and swore, and left in the middle of the night. The landlord replaced a section of drywall once, in a fit of practicality, and plaster workers came and sanded and sealed, and for 2 days there was a kind of blessed, stubborn silence. Then at midnight, on the 3rd night after their work, while he was rinsing a cup in the sink, the light in the kitchen stuttered, and a breath moved under his ear. He pressed his palm against the plaster beneath the counter and listened. And somewhere small and patient, the voice said his childhood nickname in the exact hush of a parent leaning too close. He laughed then, a small sharp sound, because he could not tell if he was brave or foolish. That laugh felt like a signal. So he began to do the thing people do when a house refuses to be ordinary. He took it apart. He loosened vent covers and pried open electrical plates and followed thermal conduits until he could see the dark behind the wall. He found hairline cracks full of dust, and in them the whisper nested and arranged itself so neatly he had to look twice to remember it was voice and not memory. Neighbors passed with groceries and children in coats, and pretended not to see the way he moved along the corridor with a screwdriver like a talisman. He had always been slight, the kind of man whose back fit between studs without scraping. Now that slightness felt useful, a shape that could slip into small betrayals. On a Tuesday, he dismantled an outlet in the living room. An old faceplate came away with a stubborn sigh and a little pocket of dark. He slid his fingers into the cavity to feel for wires and cold metal and something else, something that was not conduit. At first, it was just air, and then there was pressure against his wrist, gentle but definite. He froze, and the world narrowed to that point of contact. The rest of his body, feeling like a radio, turned off mid-song. The skin that pressed him was cool and damp, and not hairless. It had the faint, ridged plan of knuckles. A little salt on the surface, like someone who had been sweating in closed air. He jerked his hand back and caught his wrist in the jagged lip of plaster. His breath came out small and quick. Before he could think to do anything else, the whisper, soft as someone turning a page, said his middle name with the intimacy of someone who had watched him sleep. It was not the parental, teasing way he'd heard it at birthdays. It was the way a stranger might say a password. He pressed his forehead to the wall and felt, absurdly, like he could hear the voice pressing back in the grain of the wood. Adrenaline made his vision sharp and loud, the edges of frames, the silver of a spoon in the sink, and he realized he had been holding his breath for a long time. He could have called someone, then he could have left and never returned. He could have stayed very still until daylight dissolved whatever carried those sounds. Instead, he put his ear back to the plaster. The voice leaned into his skull and whispered a memory he had never told aloud to anyone, the exact words of a note he had folded into a textbook at 17 and never retrieved. He staggered for a moment. The room retreated like a scene in a mirror being pulled away. No more tests answered his questions. All he had were the marks on the wallpaper and the cold press of whatever lived inside, calling his name the way someone repeats a prayer. He sat on the floor then, back against the sofa, and let the pieces of his day slide away into the pattern. On the rug he began to unscrew the outlet with careful fingers. He pried the panel free with hands that trembled only a little. The gap smelled of old glue and something sweeter beneath it, like the back of his own neck after a fever. He flattened himself into the void where light shrank to a weak, circular beam from his phone. Nails and studs pressed into fabric and ribs. The temperature dropped. His breath condensed on the drywall. Names were everywhere, dozens of them, crude and urgent, gouged into the wood with something that had the patience of a calendar and the haste of a panic. Some were old, dates with brittle loops, initials half worn away. Others were shallow and wet like a scab that had just learned the alphabet. His own name was there, carved shallow and fresh, the edges fringing with sawdust that smelled faintly of his shampoo. He ran a fingertip along the letters. It came away powdery, then damp. A whisper filled the seam immediately, like a skirt of wind sliding along his spine. Michael Dot, it said his middle name next, as if attentive, as if keeping a register. He had never told anyone that name. He had told no one because he felt it belonged to a version of himself he was ashamed to remember. The voice owned it as casually as if it had stood at a bedside and watched him sleep for years. He felt watched. He felt the thin, hot line of someone's attention moving across the bones of his arm. He moved deeper, crawling over joists that moaned under the lightest pressure. The space narrowed and inhaled him. The phone light washed over scribbles that were not names, small faces crude lifelines, fingerprints pressed into plaster. In one beam, he saw the impression of a child's shoe heel, as though someone small had followed the studs like a path. There was a shallow notch that matched the scar on his left palm. A breath he could not call his own fogged. His glasses, voices multiplied. They didn't speak all at once, they folded and took turns, layered in a way that suggested choreography. One would press a consonant, another would finish the vowel. Sometimes a laugh slipped in, not the laugh of one person, but a chorus stitched roughly from memory. He could feel them learning him, testing syllables on the inside of his skull, checking that they could form his name like a key into the lock behind his ears. He knew, in the second it became intention, that he had gone too far to pull back. The seam that had felt reachable had widened into a throat. The air thickened until each inhalation required will, as though the wall had decided his lungs should work to keep him alive under its rules. He pressed his forehead to a stud to steady himself. There were other strokes carved there, older hands overwriting younger ones, names anointed. And then a race day sound came from the living room beyond, the faint domestic clatter of someone making coffee. The apartment sounded ordinary in a way that made his skin ache. He thought of the maintenance worker who would later find his phone and his name on the lath. He thought of being watched from outside while watched from within. The world split into layers of plaster and purpose. He tried to think of an endgame. He tried to calculate the force of a push that could reopen the panel. But calculation felt absurd there. The wall had contours he had not been taught to map. He found a deeper seam where the studs bent and left a dark channel. It smelled of cedar and a faint metallic tang. Inside the channel, names were small and dense, like pinpricks on a map. Between two names, there was a set of initials repeated until the wood wore thin. He ran his fingers along them, and with the pressure of skin on flint, something answered soft, as if a hand were moving over his hair. He flinched, and the brush became a sentence. "You can't leave." It whispered dotted, wasn't a single voice anymore. It matched the pitch of his own internal throat, the high edge of his father's anger, the warm vowel of his mother's childhood story. It said other things, two local facts no one could have known, the exact brand of cereal he kept in the second cabinet, the depressingly private way he arranged pairs of socks in the drawer. It knew the cadence of his breathing. It used that cadence to draft a hook. He pressed his palms flat to the opposite stud and pushed, testing only a little. The panel held, vibrating with a pulse translated into sound that rattled his teeth. There was intelligence at work, patience, appetite, and a willingness to be precise. The wall didn't want brute force, not at first. It wanted intimacy. It wanted the slow disrobing of someone who had all the time in the world to learn the parts of another person. And once it had those, it could step carefully, like a predator learning to mimic the call of its prey's. Child hours slipped like loose nails. He lost the ability to tell if his phone was a minute or a year old. The beam of light ran out of battery and sparked back with the same life force. The wall did not keep time in seconds. It kept a schedule built of longings and name lists. Sometimes it spoke in the thin, bright voice of a schoolmate he hadn't seen in decades. Sometimes it used the voice of a lover whose memory lived on the other side of a drawer. The voices piled, and he began to dream with his ears. He ate nothing. He had packed nothing. Food here was a rumor, an idea of nourishment. He drank condensation off the inside of studs and called it a meal because the wall allowed it. He thought of splitting his skull to get out, of scraping his way through the lath. He thought of the maintenance workers' boots, padding lazily across the hallway floor in some later hour, unminded, an echo of normalcy. He pressed his mouth to a seam and tasted dust and a metallic sweetness that might have been his own blood when he cut a fingertip trying to pry out a nail. He did not feel pain like he had before. The wall folded it into a texture, and then, in a space that had already produced impossibilities, the air condensed into a whisper that was a hand. The voices rearranged themselves. They ceased their mimicry and settled into a harmony with corporal weight. Deeper, they said, and it was not a sound so much as a pulling at the inside of him. A draft braided itself around his calves, tugging him toward a narrower seam, a place where the plaster had never met, where the house might have breathed first. He crawled, compelled. He left behind the fresh carving of his name, the last mark he had made as if to anchor himself. He left fingerprints in the dust that the wall folded over like a seamstress smoothing a wrinkle. The deeper corridor was colder, denser. It tasted of old powder and detergent, a memory of laundromat summers. The beam of his phone revealed something else, a small, rectangular cavity lined with paper fragments. They were pages torn from calendars, grocery lists, a child's homework, things ordinary and intimate, folded and placed like offerings on. One folded scrap was an address he once lived at, the apartment number he had not acknowledged aloud in years. On another, a photograph pressed flat and decayed the edge of a smile he could not quite place. The wall was a museum of borrowed life. It curated objects that smelled like him and stitched them into its own story. He felt the tug again, stronger. It pulled at his chest, then at his knees. He pushed forward until the channel opened into a wider cavity where light was anemic, and the wood bore concentric scores of names, layers upon layers, as if every occupant had been invited to sign a ledger. There, in the center, like a throat's uvula, was a hole. It was not round, it was an absence shaped like the curve of a mouth, about to speak. He reached toward it with hands that smelled of dust and old shampoo. Inside the hole, something moved, not flesh, but the suggestion of movement, the tilt of a shadow, the slide of darkness that answered to pressure. He felt the compulsion to put his head in, to listen with the hollows of his ears pressed to whatever lay beyond. The wall had already taught him that listening turned into being listened to. He put his head forward. The space beyond the hole wasn't air. It was the memory of air, the echo left behind after a breath. It tasted like the exact moment when a phone rings and you know you shouldn't answer. A chorus rose up, each voice carefully arranging his name into different clothes. They didn't shout. They didn't need to. They leaned. They remembered his syllables and repeated them until he was the sound he tried to pull back. The opening, which had seemed inviting, had become a pressure contracting around his skull. The wall had learned to close. The beam of his phone pitched, and slid light became the thing he was losing. For a sliver of awareness, he understood the maintenance worker. How ordinary he must have looked, walking by an ordinary wall, in an ordinary week. Oblivion has an aesthetic. It prefers the unremarkable hands. He felt hands on the back of his neck, cool and damp, like palms from an attic. They guided him forward gently, with the intimacy of someone tucking a child into bed. He felt a tightening, an embrace of the vertebrae, not rough, not vicious, precise and intimate, until the hole took his chin, and then his mouth. He could feel the shape of lath inside his cheeks, the roughness of the grain like tiny teeth. The last thing he heard within himself was his own name, threaded through every voice, not a call anymore, but a statement, like a fact one recites when a ritual is complete. He tasted plaster and the metallic tang that had earlier been dust. Then there was a sensation of sliding and a bright, non-verbal shock, like when a bulb finally gives. The phone light died in his hand outside. The apartment calmed, as if a long, murmuring argument had reached a conclusion. The living room clock kept time. A kettle boiled. A radio played an undistinguished program. The wall resumed its usual skin. For days, weeks, it kept nothing to show. The maintenance worker would later peel back a panel and find a phone jammed between the joists. He would see the scrawl of a name on the lath and think briefly and casually of an absence. He would test the phone and see a last, dying screen, a smear of fingerprints, and the ghost of a beam when he stepped back, allowing himself to breathe in the room. His name came from nowhere and everywhere in the wall. It said his name like an invitation and a claim. He stiffened, because the cadence was not the walls alone now. It had learned to mimic the human hesitation that comes right before a decision. Then the call became a voice he recognized, wrong-angled familiar. The tone someone uses when they mean something urgent, but aren't sure whether to be kind. He answered the name the way one answers the door to a stranger. He reached up to the panel he had just set back, fingers brushing the edges. It was cool. A laugh slid through the studs like a blade. He braced himself because knowledge had clarified into purpose. The wall wanted company. He turned, and the space where the panel had been was only wall again. But the wall had his name in its grain now. It had another name. It had started to collect voices, that would make other men and women answer. That is what it had learned to do best: to fold the human into a small, tunable sound, until walking past a patch of drywall felt like stepping across a threshold later, when no one remembered precisely how time had been parceled. When stories turned to hints, the apartment would be occupied again. Some things would smell faintly of dust. A new name would appear in fine, recent letters between old scores on a stud. People are good at making patterns. Patterns keep them feeling safe. The wall is more patient than patterns. The wall waits like a secret that has learned to speak. If you liked this, he asks, with the same small, intimate tone that taught the drywall to call names. Like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment below with the time you listened to this story.